All right, so let's resume talking about biological evolution. There are people, including people in the state, who are not entirely down with the whole Darwin thing and may have certain objections, but you don't understand biology if you don't understand evolution. It's probably the single most important idea anybody's ever had. And I can compare it to studying human history. Just as you can't understand the situation the United States is in now without knowing about slavery, the Civil War, the Cold War, everything that has happened in the past, for better or for worse. By the same token, you can't understand life if you don't have some understanding of the fact that life has a history, and that history has left traces that we can trace today. Think about the Civil War for a minute. That's left traces that include everything from diaries to official war records to newspaper articles, photographs, battlefields, and graveyards and places where you can dig up bullets and things like that. That's left a great deal of traces behind. You put them all together and you still don't have the complete story of absolutely everything. And certainly there are military historians and political historians that would disagree a lot on the details of the American Civil War, but we can still piece together the fact that it happened, and we can trace its repercussions that continue to resonate to this day, as any given evening watching the news will unfortunately remind you. Those of you who are not from the United States can substitute major events in your own nation's histories, and it's the same thing. You have to understand the history of life to understand why life is the way it is now. And we talked about the various things that Darwin and a lot of other people, not just him, had observed. Everything from what we now call biogeography, the question of why you find species, where you find them, to vestigial structures and similarities in embryos, all of these things. The simplest way to explain all of that was the idea that life on Earth had changed over time, and the change was what we would now call genetic change. The reason why living things look like each other is because they are descended from common ancestors. The reason living things look different from each other is that over many generations, living things have changed from what their ancestors looked like. There you've got a diagram from one of Darwin's early notebooks, just after he got back from his voyage, trying to give a picture of how old species, starting down here at the base, might not just change over time, but might branch and give rise to new species, like leaves at the tips of tree branches that all ultimately come from common roots. I will have more to say about this coming up on Monday, but real quick, I don't mean to put her on the spot, but we have a person in this class whose last name is Hambeacon. And if you've spent any time in Conway, you know that we have tons of Hambeacons in town. Last time I looked in this ancient artifact that we used to use back in the old days called the phone book, there were something like 20 odd people named Hambeacon in Conway. And there are businesses named for, Hambeacon, like there's that office supply business named Hambeacon. And I've met several other people named Hambeacon. And like Conway, Arkansas is sort of the world capital of people named Hambeacon. The simplest explanation for why that's the case is that there must have been some guy named Mr. Hambeacon, who came to Conway, settled down, and had kids, and they had kids, and all of the descendants of the original Mr. Hambeacon have inherited that person's last name. It's not the only possible explanation, but it's far and away the most likely. And you could say the same thing in Conway about the Freyaldenhovens, or the Siebenmorgens, or the Otts, or the Maltbias, or the Quattlebaums. Heck, you could go to Walkertown, North Carolina, and say the same thing about the Wagoners. That's where my particular family happens to be from. The simplest explanation for those patterns of human families is common ancestry and the fact that people pass on last names from one generation to the next. Much the same thing happens in the biological world. Organisms don't pass on their last names, but they have heredity and pass their traits on. And those traits can change from one generation to the next. So what Chuck D actually did that's so important was two things. First, he gathered more evidence that evolution had happened than anyone had done before, putting it all in a book that he published in 1859 called On the Origin of Species. The second thing is that wasn't that radical. There were already people who were pretty sure that life on Earth had undergone some kind of change over many, many generations. I mean, you've got the fossils to show you that. And a lot of people at the time were fine with the idea. But Darwin also proposed a mechanism for what had made that change happen, what was causing it. And it's a mechanism that we can observe today. And that is the theory of evolution by natural selection. We've added an enormous amount to this. I teach an entire course in it. And we've progressed a long way from where Darwin was, which is, that's the way science works. But his fundamental insight still holds up really, really well. And it started when, this is a good reason why science majors need to pay attention in their humanities classes. Darwin happened to be reading a book by a guy named Thomas Malthus. Malthus argued that a human population would always be doomed to outgrow its possible food supply. A human population in a country could increase its food supply by cultivating more land or developing better varieties of crops and food animals, things like that. But population, and he argued this mathematically, would always go up faster than the food supply could. And this set up a problem that you had to address with the right sort of policies. Well, you can argue how right Malthus was in sociology class for human societies, but Darwin realized that the same thing applied to any species, not just humanity. Anything from bacteria to baboons followed the same logic. And as he put it, under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results of this would be the formation of a new species. Okay, how does this work? We'll come back to this towards the very end of the course, but right now, populations of living organisms are capable of what we call exponential growth. That basically means that a population over a certain time interval will double, and then double again over another time interval, and then double again and again and again. Start with 2 bunny rabbits, and after a certain length of time, you'll get 4, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32, and then 64, and so on. And in theory, populations should be able to do that infinitely. In nature, however, population numbers can go up, they can go down, they can zig and they can zag, and sometimes they shoot up and sometimes they crash. But by and large, they stay roughly constant, very roughly. There's a lot of zigging and zagging, but the point is you never see sustained exponential growth. And therefore, it's not possible for all of the offspring produced in a population of any living thing to survive, whether that population is squirrels or bunnies or clover or oak trees or edible chanterelle mushrooms or streptococcus bacteria in your throat, any of those. Not all of the offspring can survive. They mathematically can't. And that sets up a, don't overinterpret this, a metaphor that Darwin called the struggle for existence. Now, that struggle for existence is not necessarily combat. If you walk through a forest, for example, you might know that there's only so much sunlight available per square meter of the Earth's surface for trees to grow, and tall trees will block the sunlight of shorter trees. There's not enough sunlight for every last acorn to grow into a mighty oak tree. That doesn't mean the trees are beating up each other. They're not going around and punching each other. I mean, unless they're the Ents or something like that, you know, maybe Treebeard is going around beating up his rivals, but it's not likely. But it does mean that there is only a fixed amount of solar energy available for plants, and plants that get shaded out either have to adapt somehow to living on less light, or they don't grow and they'll end up dying. So here's what I mean by when I say it's not possible. Here's a couple of fruit flies engaged in the practice of making more fruit flies. These are very common. These are the flies that will invade your kitchen if you leave a bunch of bananas out for too long. I'm sure it has happened in my house. I'm sure it's happened in yours. These are the flies that you see a lot of if you've ever worked in the back room of the produce section of Harps. I say that because I've had students who have. Their life cycle under ideal conditions takes about 7 days, from eggs being laid to little maggots eating, you know, overripe bananas, to a pupa stage that's kind of like the cocoon of a butterfly, to the adults hatching and maturing and getting ready to mate themselves. That life cycle only takes 7 days. So if you started with one pair of flies, in 7 days, you might have 100 pairs of flies. In another 7 days, you might have thousands of pairs of flies. And if we had exponential growth, if every fly lived its full lifespan and reproduced as often as it could, it would take you 1 year to get a ball of flies the size of the Earth. Obviously, this cannot possibly happen in the real world. I mean, as proof, I offer the fact that the Earth has not been replaced with a ball of nothing but flies. You know, we've still got, you know, rocks and stuff. So something has to be acting to keep fruit fly populations down. And there's probably a lot of things. There could be diseases.
Mosquito spray.
There could be predators. You know, spiders and things like that. There could be competition for food. Fruit flies might starve to death if they can't get enough, you know, overripe fruit. There could be some of those fruit flies might never be able to find mates. Maybe they, you know, just can't find the right fly. A lot of those fruit flies got killed by, you know, people with insecticide. You know, there could be lots more things going on, but one way or another, not every fruit fly gets to have lots of babies. In fact, the majority of fruit flies probably don't. Something has to happen, and in fact, many things happen to keep those populations within limits. Not every fruit fly makes it. Okay, That should be obvious. Second part, organisms in a population vary among themselves. They may look different. They may have different invisible abilities, like different resistance to disease or different abilities to tolerate high temperatures or different requirements for nutrients. Organisms are different. You know, you are different from all of the other students in this class in ways that are visible, like your hair, skin, and eye color, and in ways that may not be visible, like how likely you are to catch a cold or how well you can tolerate summer heat and humidity, or even, what, genetic disorder you might have been born with. We're all different. We all vary. And Darwin didn't really understand why. And to be fair, nobody else did either. But we know that variation is, at least in part, heritable, meaning you tend to inherit traits, your features, from your parents. You look more like your biological parents than you look like two random people just, dragged in off the street. You don't just look more like them. You may have inherited internal features of them, maybe susceptibility to certain diseases or, physical strength, features of your metabolism, things like that. Those all get passed down from parent to child. So organisms vary, and that variation is, at least in part, heritable. And this is true in people. It is also true in Donax variabilis, the surf clam from the Gulf Coast of Florida that I used to pick up a lot of when my family would go vacation at Fort Walton Beach when I was a little kid. You can find lots of these little clams, and you can see they're all different colors, and they've got different shell patterns as well. You could find just as much variation if you were to, go out on one of the lawns on campus and really start studying the clover. It might take you a while to find it, but there's variation there too. Every clover plant is a little bit different from the others. And we know that variation can be inherited. Clover offspring show the traits that their clover parents did. And this is true, again, it's everywhere from bacteria to baboons to boletus mushrooms. It's all over the map. Okay, so 1 and 2 ought to be pretty obvious. 3 is where they come together. In a population of individuals, the individuals vary. They're all different. Some of those individuals vary for whatever reason in ways that increase the probability that they will survive and reproduce. Some individuals vary in ways that increase the chances that they will survive and reproduce. Others vary in ways that decrease their chances. Take a population of rabbits in the forest, and all of a sudden the big bad wolf appears. Some of those rabbits will naturally, for whatever reason, be just a little bit faster at running away. And they will have better chances of surviving the wolf and going on to make bunnies of their own. Other of those rabbits will vary in such a way that they will run more slowly, and they will have less good chances of surviving and reproducing. Some of those bunnies might vary in a different way. They might blend into the forest better. Others might vary in such a way that they're more conspicuous and more likely to be seen by a predator. Other bunnies might vary in such a way that they're better observers and better able to see the wolf and get away from it. Other bunnies might vary in the opposite way, and they may notice their surroundings less and be less likely to spot the wolf before the wolf spots them. Individuals that vary in ways that increase their chances are going to make more offspring like themselves. Fast bunnies will get away from the wolf, maybe not every time, but their odds are better. And they will have offspring that are likely to be fast themselves, because fast bunnies are likely to have fast offspring. Bunnies that blend in very well are likelier to get away from the wolf than bunnies that stick out like a sore thumb, as we say. And bunnies that blend in very well are likelier to have babies, and those babies are likely to inherit the trait of blending in. So individuals that vary in ways that increase the chances that they'll reproduce will make more offspring like themselves. Individuals that don't vary in those ways will leave fewer offspring like themselves. The end result is that a population of the species will change over time, not within a single lifespan, but over many. The average phenotype will shift from one generation to the next. You'll see that word phenotype again coming up. It's basically what we use to mean the total of all of the traits and features of an individual, like your hair color, skin color, eye color, build, height, weight, risk of breast cancer. All of those things might be part of your phenotype. And the average phenotype in a population will shift from one generation to the next. And that is natural selection. Darwin wanted to do some experiments with this, and he realized that people have been experimenting with this for literally thousands of years. He looked at artificial selection as an analog for natural selection. And he ended up for several years raising fancy pigeons and doing some crossbreeding experiments and observing the traits of different breeds. This was a fairly popular hobby at the time. Darwin lived out in the country and was actually physically ill for much of his life, but he was able to take care of fancy pigeons. I don't know how many of you are into pigeons, but there are hundreds of different breeds of pigeon. This is just a few that were around in Darwin's time. And you can see there's quite a variety. We have pigeons of different colors, pigeons with huge tails, and pigeons with tiny beaks, and pigeons with weird rings around their eyes, and pigeons with ruffs of feathers on their shoulders. There are turbot pigeons and barb pigeons and fantails and pouters and nuns and runts, hundreds of different pigeon breeds. Where they all came from is this. This is the wild rock pigeon. This is Columbia livia. It's a wild bird, but people have domesticated it. They've introduced it to a lot of places, and it's gone feral. So it was actually native, I think, to Southern Europe and Central Asia, but people have transported it all over the world. So this is basically the, the same bird that's, you can spot around Conway, in the park, beating up old ladies and taking their breadcrumbs. This is the wild rock pigeon. And Darwin actually reviewed a lot of the history. He found that raising pigeons went back to the ancient Egyptians. So for thousands of years, people have kept pigeons, and they produced a ridiculously large number of pigeon varieties, of pigeon breeds. Everything from the black fantail to whatever the heck this thing is, which I forget. Those are both fancy pigeons. And they were produced by breeders breeding a bunch of pigeons, picking out individuals that happen to have traits that they happen to like, picking out individuals that had fancier tails or longer necks or prettier colors or calmer disposition, calmer moods, letting those individuals make babies and produce the next generation of pigeons. And then the pigeons that don't have the traits that they like probably end up on the barbecue grill or whatever it is that you do with pigeons that you want to dispose of. So you pick out individuals in your flock that have traits that you like, save those individuals for breeding, get rid of the rest, and from one generation to the next, your flock starts changing. You can breed pigeons that have larger tails or prettier colors or longer necks or whatever it is that you want. And these can get pretty darn weird. I actually knew somebody who used to raise fancy pigeons, and he used to keep the pigeon breed on the left. That's a Bukhara trumpeter with these huge ruffs of feathers that completely hide its head. I promise you there is a head in there, but it's not obvious. And it's got these big ruffs of feathers on its feet. And according to my friend, it's also completely stupid. Bukhara trumpeters are basically giant zucchinis that have feathers. They're kind of dumb as far as pigeons go. Compare that to the Scandaroon pigeon on the right with this great big hooked beak and a different build and different colors and no bunches of feathers on the feet. If you didn't already know that these were both pigeons and I told you, hey, these are wild birds, you'd probably think they were completely separate species. Even bird specialists, people who'd spent their lives studying birds might not realize that these are in fact descended from a common ancestor, and yet they are, and we know because we've got records of it. And the differences are not just differences of feather color, they affect the skeleton. Up there at the top left, that's what your wild pigeon looks like. You can compare the skull to 3 different domestic pigeons, and you can see the skull has changed shape quite a bit. Not just the beak, but other parts too. You can even modify pigeon behavior. Homing pigeons, people race those by taking them away from their homes and seeing how fast they can fly back. Homing pigeons have navigated home from as far as 1,100 miles and can fly at an average of 50 miles an hour. English short-faced tumblers can't fly nearly that fast or that far, but they do backflips in midair, which is why they're called tumbler pigeons. Parlor roller pigeons can't fly, but they'll turn somersaults on the ground. And I've seen footage of parlor roller owners racing their pigeons, not by making them fly, but by bowling them. They look it's kind of like playing lawn bowling, except the balls have wings and flip-flop themselves. It's really kind of strange. People do weird stuff with pigeons. And all of that's been produced by artificial selection. People have picked out, excuse me, people who've raised pigeons have picked out the fastest flyers or the most elegant tumblers or whatever trait it is that they want, saved the best for breeding, gotten rid of the others, do that over many generations, and you've got a whole population of pigeons with new traits, new features. And varieties can become almost indefinitely different from each other. On the left, that is another rock pigeon. That's the wild pigeon that we talked about earlier. That's the one that's native to Europe and Western Asia, but it's been introduced to other continents as well. We have these living wild in the United States now. On the right, that's a different wild pigeon species called the pink-necked fruit dove. And aside from the color, you can see that they're very similar birds. They're about the same size. They've got the same shaped beak, the same shape of body. And here we've got two domestic pigeons. On the left, the yellow Brunner pouter, which has the ability to inflate its upper digestive tract so it walks around looking like its neck is blowing a bubble, compared with the Ackerman tumbler with those ruffs of feathers on its head. These two breeds of fancy pigeon, we know were produced by artificial selection over probably just a couple of centuries in this case, and yet they're more different from each other in every respect than those wild species of pigeon that we saw earlier. So if artificial selection can do all of this, can make a yellow Brunner pouter and an Ackerman tumbler in just a couple of decades, maybe a couple of centuries, what could natural selection do given millions of years to act? I'll give you a few more case studies to close this out. 1981, there's a couple in Southern California, the Rugas, who adopt a stray cat that they name Shulamith, who's got a feature that nobody's ever seen before. Shulamith had curly ears. So there she is. We don't need to know just yet why Shulamith has curly ears, but the Rugas thought this was adorable. Nobody had ever seen a curly-eared cat before. The Rugas thought this was cute, so they bred her 3 times to 3 different male cats. And Shulamith had 3 litters of babies, and some of those babies inherited the curly-eared trait from Mama Shulamith. Well, the Rugas kept those kittens that had the curly ears and bred them. Kittens that didn't have the curly ear trait got spayed or neutered. You know, they were perfectly nice cats, but they didn't let them breed. Kittens that did have the curly ear trait were allowed to grow up and encouraged to breed. Their offspring, it was the same thing. The offspring in every generation that had the curly ears got to breed. Offspring that didn't have the curly ears got spayed or neutered. And after many generations of this, a new breed of cat was born. These are called American curl cats. And it continues to be developed as breeders pick out cats that have the nicest curls, let them breed, and cats that don't have the curly ears end up spayed or neutered. That's artificial selection, and it's created a new cat breed in the course of just a few decades. If you're not into cats, here's a dog example. My cousin used to be, and probably still is, a really big fan of pugs. He always had pugs running around the house. And this is what a modern pug looks like. I assume you've seen them. You know, I assume as kids, you probably saw the movie Milo and Otis. So this is a modern pug. Compare that with what a pug looked like in 1802. On the left, that's an 1802 pug. And you can see that, for one thing, the pugs 2 centuries ago actually had noses. They had much longer noses and much longer jaws. They're still snub-nosed, but not nearly as much as the modern pug. They've got less compact bodies and relatively longer legs and relatively longer tails. The breed has changed noticeably in 200 years because, for whatever reason, dog breeders have picked out pugs with flatter and flatter faces and more compact bodies, encourage those dogs to breed, and not bred dogs that didn't have these flat faces and compact bodies that pug owners tend to want. There's actually a movement afoot to reverse this process because pugs with noses that are that flat and faces that are that short often develop breathing problems and aren't healthy. So there's actually a movement to try to breed what people call retro pugs, that'll still have, the loving attitude that pugs tend to have, but have much less flat faces and so lead healthier lives, getting back to what pugs used to look like a couple of centuries ago. That's also artificial selection. Here's a longer term example. This is Brassica oleracea. It lives in bad soil and it tastes kind of nasty. And people must have been really, really hungry to ever think of eating this. But they ate it at some point, maybe several thousand years ago, and it didn't kill anybody, and it is fairly nutritious. So gardeners started growing it in their soils, at least as far back as the ancient Romans, probably farther back than that. They started growing this thing in their gardens, and at least they didn't need great soil to grow it, and it did have nutrients in it. And at every generation, gardeners picked out the plants that were best, that were biggest, that were best tasting, that had more leaves, that had more digestible leaves, that were easier to eat, whatever the case might be. Save the best plants to produce seed. Plants that didn't have the best traits were the ones that got plucked up and ended up in the soup. And after a few thousand years of this, we now have broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi, which you may not know, that's the plant on the lower left with swollen stems, Brussels sprouts, collard greens, kale, and of course, cultivated cabbage, all descend from that wild cabbage plant that I showed you. These are all derived from the same species of ancestor. And they come by artificial selection because farmers have kept seeds from the tastiest plants and plants that aren't tasty or that don't have lots of leaves or that don't have tasty flowers or stems, or that in any other way, plants that aren't desirable. Those are the ones that end up getting plucked up and thrown out or thrown into the soup, while only the best plants are the ones that are encouraged to produce seeds for the next generation. End result, we have these varieties that are all very different from the wild cabbage that we started with maybe 2,000 years ago. Here's an even longer term example. 10,000 years ago, there was a wild grass native to Mexico called teosinte. And this is the seeds of a teosinte plant. The seeds are nutritious, but they're encased in a coat that has to be shelled by hand. And you probably have to be kind of desperate to start eating teosinte. The seeds aren't very big. They are nutritious, but it's a lot of work to get the seed coats off. But people discovered that if you plant teosinte seeds, you get new teosinte plants. And they started planting seeds from the plants that had the biggest and the most digestible seeds. And they repeated this process through many generations. In every generation, the teosinte plants varied. Some plants had traits that people liked. Others had traits that people didn't like. The ones with the traits people liked get saved for the next generation. The ones with the traits that people don't like end up getting boiled. End result, we go from teosinte to corn. Corn is domesticated teosinte. You can see there's a whopping difference between teosinte and modern corn. And of course, there's not just one variety of corn. There are 300 different corn varieties. The sweet corn that you eat off the cob is different from the varieties of corn that are ground up for cornmeal. And that's different from the corn that's fed to cattle. And that's different from the corn that you pop. And those are different from the colorful corn that you might see at Thanksgiving. They're all different varieties, all produced by artificial selection. Last one. Again, don't memorize these specific case studies. I'm not going to ask you a question about chiltepín berries, but I'll ask you questions about something that shows the same principle of artificial selection. Capsicum annuum is a bushy plant with red berries that's native to Mexico. The Spanish name for it is the chiltepín, although they sometimes call it the gringo killer, because if you eat the berries, it produces this horrible burning sensation in your mouth. It feels like your mouth is on fire. Somebody must have been either really desperate or a total masochist, but people started eating chiltepín berries several thousand years ago. I'm not sure how long ago. And they picked out chiltepín berries that were biggest or tastiest or less agonizingly painful, and took the seeds from those berries to plant the next generation. Do that over and over again for hundreds or thousands of years, and you go from chiltepín berries to bell peppers at the upper left, chiles poblanos at the upper right. Those are the ones they use in Mexico to make chiles rellenos. Cayenne peppers make your ground red pepper seasoning at the lower left. Aurora peppers are mostly grown for their color at the lower right. And there are hundreds more varieties of peppers. Almost all the ones you'd see in the store ultimately come from chiltepines by artificial selection. And it is 10:50, so I'm going to stop the recording right there and leave you to ponder that.